As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
If you can think about the half the country that voted differently from you, kind of shifting off this 100% and 0% to 99% and 1% gives you some grace when you interact or have conversations with everyday people, I think is really powerful, because it means that the person on the subway or the person at the PTA meeting is not 100% evil, right? They're just like trying to figure out their world as best they can. And it doesn't mean that you have to give up your moral convictions, and it doesn't mean you have to give up thinking that maybe they're more to blame than you are. But if you approach a political opponent and you say, well, what are your hopes for the future? What are you most worried about? What are you afraid about? These are deep questions that reveals people's humanity and their vulnerability.
That was Kurt Gray on Psychologists Off the Clock. We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
I'm Yael Schoenbrunn, a clinical psychologist, faculty at Brown University, author of Work, Parent Thrive, and a biweekly newsletter on relationships.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
This is Yael. I'm here with Debbie to introduce an episode, my first, that I've done the interview as a return co-host for Psychologists Off the Clock. And I'll be interviewing Kurt Gray, whose new book is called Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. And this is a topic that I'm very excited to talk about because moral outrage is something that is so omnipresent. And, there's that saying that if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. But I actually think that's not quite true. I think we feel moral outrage whether or not we're paying attention, because it's just something that's so inherently wired into the human psyche. And just a quick note that during this interview, you can hear my dog barking a little bit. So hopefully you don't feel too morally outraged about it. Since reading Kurt's book, I've been thinking a lot about moral outrage and looking at the world through this lens of seeing how much moral outrage colors how we see things, how we respond, how it's such a part of classic literature. For example, I was reading Frankenstein, and you can really see how moral outrage is coloring the interactions between Frankenstein and the creature that he created. It's notable how often we feel morally outraged, and also how our moral outrage can be sparked by people seeing humanity in those who we think don't have the right to be seen as human. So clearly, these are issues that we've contended with for as long as humans have had conscious thoughts, and really, we are wired to inherently be morally outraged, and there are benefits to our moral outrage and there are costs. So sorry for that super long-winded introduction, but I think this is such an important topic. And Debbie, I'm definitely curious to hear what your thoughts are.
I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'll just share that every time we do a topic like this, I have really complicated feelings about it on the personal level. And I'm putting this out there in part because I think a lot of listeners will feel the same way. on the one hand, I agree that this is a problem and that we all need to do our best to find humanity and move out of this place of divisiveness. And I see some behaviors going on in the world that I find really abhorrent. And it's really not something that I'm really excited about to pause and look for the humanity. For instance, I see these online trolls who are just spewing hatred. And why are they doing this? I could stop and think about that and think about their perspective and what's going on. But I'm just like, stop it. And that's something that you talked to Kurt about. And by the way, he's terrific. I think he's really brilliant on this topic. For instance, should we be looking at these awful historical figures and trying to understand them in terms of their history and that kind of thing? I also think one thing that I am thinking of right now is, Yael, you recommended the book Doppelganger by Naomi Klein to me. And so I kind of got into her work. And she has this idea of shock politics, the shock doctrine, and how I think sometimes people are trying to fuel our outrage. They're trying to shock us and get us all mad to distract us. And so for me personally, I'm really working on staying grounded in this world that we live in. And I actually think that this is really helpful for that, right? Which is to kind of pause and get less reactive. And I talked about that back in September with Diana Smith, too, in terms of outrage journalism and thinking about who's benefiting from my outrage. These kinds of conversations I actually think help me. They don't make it so that all of a sudden I don't care about this anymore. I'm totally fine with whatever everybody's doing, but more like it just helps me approach these issues from a more grounded and balanced perspective. And so that's my thought. These are kind of painful episodes, I think. I wish the world wasn't like this. And yet they do help me.
Yeah, well, I think that you're saying a few things that I find really useful in terms of the functionality of seeing the humanity in people that either we dislike or that we really think that their behavior is seriously problematic, like harmful to the extreme. And the goal isn't to sort of let those people off the hook. It is to be more effective in society. And so the example that you gave, Debbie, of people trolling online, what is the function of our outrage there? I think the function, sort of from an evolutionary perspective, is to protect ourselves. But what actually happens if you engage in the conflict with the troll online is that the vitriol goes up on both sides. Nothing productive happens. It's just a lot of ugly outrage. Everybody feels crappy. Maybe, the platform benefits because they have more eyeballs, right, to the question of who benefits from this. But it's not like communication, productivity, anything cooperative is happening. And so one of the functions then of seeing the humanity or asking that question of what's the function of the moral outrage is to kind of slow it down and to get more effective in our response. So you don't have to befriend a troll, and you certainly don't have to condone terrible behavior by people perpetrating atrocities. But the function of saying, are these humans and what are they afraid of, or what are they trying to get out of it? And how do I want to respond to that is quite useful, even if you're not going to be their friend. And then, of course, there's the question of what happens when our moral outrage button gets pressed in our personal relationships and how we respond to that in ways that are workable for the kind of relationships that we want to build.
Well, and I'll tell a quick funny story because you do talk about marriage and, you sort of apply this to these personal relationships. My husband and I both have noticed something, which is that we get really mad at each other about something like, oh, you left this clutter around, or you put the car keys in a weird place. I couldn't find them. But then we realize it was us, right? Oh, no, that's my clutter, or I'm the one who drove the car last. I put the keys there. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, that's fine. No big deal. And so it's like when it's the other person, I'm like, I can't stand him anymore. This is it. And then I'm like, oh, wait, it was me. Never mind. It's cool. And anyway, it's just funny how we kind of do have that instinct of outrage toward people. And so I really appreciated the conversation in terms of our marriages and other relationships as well.
Totally. I mean, you're getting to this really interesting bias that's called the fundamental attribution error, which is like when somebody else did it, where, our moral outrage is totally likely to go up and say, you did wrong.
Sure.
And right. This is probably about your bad character. Whereas when we did it, we're like, oh, it's just because I'm tired and it's really not that big of a deal. So this is, something also that that we don't discuss explicitly, but I think is kind of embedded in that way that we can be so morally outraged by other people's behavior when if it's somebody that is close to us or ourselves, it's much less likely to set us off, except when it's your husband.
Exactly.
Or partner.
Are people funny?
Yes. I think it is useful to see the humor when and where you can, because, these attributes are not going anywhere. And so the more that we can understand them and find a little levity, I think the easier it is to kind of hold it. And again, sort of bring our best selves to the fore, and for the purpose of keeping our side of the street clean and creating more opportunity for relationships in our personal lives, but also in society at large, to be more productive, cooperative, collaborative. And again, to sort of figure out when somebody is really not behaving well, what is the most effective way that we can respond to that? Again, we don't have to condone it, but we can be more effective than when our moral outrage isn't sort of clouding our judgment or driving our behavior. So I hope you get a lot out of this episode, and we'll definitely be interested to hear what the experience is like in listening to this, because as Debbie notes, these conversations can be really hard and sort of uncomfortable to have or to even to listen to. So let us know how it felt and what tips that you took away that were useful. So enjoy the listen. Kurt Gray is a professor in psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he directs the Deepest Beliefs Lab and the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. He is also the author of the new book, Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. Welcome, Kurt.
Thanks for having me.
I am very excited to talk about this topic. It is very timely. However, I feel like it is always timely.
Yeah, we've been divided for a long time, but certainly more so today than we have been in a long time. So I guess that's good for the book. It's not great for our well-being. We're always angry, but there you have it.
We're going to talk about anger and what prompts us to be angry, but also some of the solutions that your book offers in how to bridge the divide between people who we see as our opposition. But let me start with this point of what's the point? Because you write that this book is, quote, for everyone who wants to better understand the other side and the hidden psychology behind moral conflicts. And you also note that once you empathize with people's perceptions of harm, you can better understand the people on the other side. But many of us don't feel particularly interested in wanting to understand the other side. So I wonder if you can start us off by just helping us hook onto some motivation for wanting to understand people who we see as other, as bad, as immoral.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's true. I mean, not only are we so divided today, but part of that divide is just not wanting to bridge it, which I think is unfortunate. But I do think that many of us are more motivated than we might at first feel. So if you think about family members, about friends, many of us have lost friends or family or felt estranged from people we wish we were closer to because of politics. And, I think the first time, it happened really after Trump's initial election. People were really angry on both sides, right? And didn't want to have this desire to reconnect. And I've found talking to people after this most recent Trump victory that now people are kind of, I don't know, in some sense like, well, this is how the world is now. And I would like to move forward with my life and with my relationships and with my friends and family. And I think the same is true with our country as well, right? Like folks want to move forward. And even pragmatically, if you want to achieve goals, social change, you need to work together with people who maybe disagree with you. So I think there's a relationship thing, but I think also there's a pragmatic, let's work together kind of motivation.
That's 100% right. It's sort of like, this is the world that we live in and we need to collaborate. I also see this like on a just intimate personal relationship level, that regardless of how much you agree with somebody else about politics, religion, raising children, managing finances, there's going to be things that you disagree on. And so to be able to understand what comes up for us when we disagree and to figure out how to bridge those divides in ways that are productive and connecting, as opposed to, defaulting to some of our darker demons, I think is quite helpful.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And as I argue in the book, right, I mean, moral disagreement is not just something that happens in politics, although it happens most obviously there, right? You can disagree at the PTA meeting with another parent. You can disagree with your spouse about how you're supposed to interact with your mother or father-in-law, right? You can have a moral disagreement with your kid about how they acted at some birthday party, right? I mean, moral disagreements are everywhere, and it's the same understanding that applies no matter where.
Hi, listeners. It's Emily. You may have heard me reference my small group course, Parent Smarter, Not Harder, and wondered, what is this and how do I find out more? So I carefully designed the 6-session course to meet the needs of parents who are eager to support their children's skills and competence, but don't know how or where to start. We meet virtually for 1 hour a week over 6 consecutive weeks. We not only explore what it means to you to be a good parent, but we set realistic goals for meaningful change. Just listen to what one group member said. I came away from the group coaching experience with a clear framework for making changes at home with confidence that benefit my boys' autonomy and my sanity. Enrollment is officially open only for the month of January, so act now if this sounds like a good fit for you. There are limited spots because I like to keep it small so we can go deep. For more information, visit my website, emilyedlinphd.com/course.
So let's start with defining morality. What is it and why do we need it? What is the function of morality?
Well, morality in its simplest sense is just the internal feeling we have of right or wrong. And I mean, we could go real deep in philosophy. I don't know if I want to go there, but I think why we have it is from an evolutionary perspective, we're a group species. We live together in groups. We depend on each other to survive and to thrive. But group living requires that we, behave in a sense, that we work together to cooperate. And if I'm walking down the street and I see someone eating a donut that looks good to me, I can't just push them down and take the donut, right? As much as I'd like to. And we all face that tension in a group living society, right? We have to suppress our kind of most selfish impulses and cooperate with others. And so that's what morality really evolved to do, right? We suppress our selfishness and we work together with others. And we have an internal model or sense that we not only should cooperate ourselves, but if someone else does something we think is antisocial or ultimately, I argue, harmful to ourselves, our society, we want to condemn them, we want to blame them, we want to punish them. So that's what morality is. It's this condemning the behaviors and the people who we think cause harm to ourselves, our society, and especially the vulnerable.
So it is a helpful thing because it keeps us in check. But what are some ways that morality can get us into trouble? How can morality sometimes divide us when it's intended to sort of protect our social structures?
Yeah, it's a great question. So morality evolved, right, to prevent harm, but to prevent harm in a very specific way, which is harm to our in-groups and the harms that we most powerfully see, that are most salient to us. And so those salient harms are often those kind of external threats. So that can be foreign tribes, foreign nations. But even in America today, that could be the other side, the people who voted differently than us. And so maybe that is we dehumanize people who are different than us, who we see as a threat. We sometimes use violence against them in the worst case, right? And so it's all about how we understand those threats and who we understand as a predator to our own way of life. And that's which our morality kind of license us to harm.
In your book and even in your answer now, we're talking and we're thinking more on the group level, but this is something that I see in intimate relationships in the couples therapy room, where you can start off your life with a partner thinking they're your in-group, but something happens where you feel harmed, or you genuinely were harmed, and you begin to see them as your opposition. It's this sort of wiring that we have of in-group, out-group, but it can operate more at the individual level too.
Absolutely. And before I studied morality, I studied how people make sense of the minds of others. I mean, relationships are really kind of a combination of two minds. And the funny thing about studying mind perception, as I call it, like making sense of other minds, is that not only is it hard to make sense of another person's mind because there's a gap between our minds, right? Like I can't ever really know what you're feeling, but if I'm in pain, if I feel aggrieved or victimized, it's so overwhelming to me. It occupies my entire consciousness that it's so easy for someone kind of outside of that for me to demonize them and see them as someone othered, right? So a spouse, a friend, a family member, right? If I feel like I'm suffering, it's so easy for me to project that kind of perceptions of blame on someone else.
Yeah, and I think that that's something so important to recognize, that all human minds are wired to do, that when we are in pain, we have this tendency of flattening other people, of seeing them as villains, ourselves as victims. But I think it's something that is so important to recognize on the group level and on the individual relationship level. But before we dive into that, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the history of research on morality, because your book provides this beautiful sort of narrative arc of how science in general is always trying to get closer to the truth, and how the process of doing research is really a quest for getting closer to these fundamental truths. And it requires us to remain openly curious, even skeptical about what we think we know, so that we can find out what we don't yet know or what we're missing. So we actually did an episode on a framework called Moral Foundations. It's episode 51 for those who are interested in checking it out. But your research is sort of like the next step. And so I wonder if you can help us understand how your research helps to advance what we understand about morality.
Sure. So I think it might be helpful for listeners to step back and think about that arc, right? So the very beginning of moral psychology, everyone agreed that morality, our moral minds, were about harm. So we condemned acts that were harmful, which is why kids, for instance, think it's okay if the teacher says you can wear pajamas to school. Let's say, okay, I can wear pajamas to school. The teacher says so. But if the teacher says, okay, you can punch your classmate in the face, kids still say that's still wrong, even if the teacher says it's okay, right? Because punching your classmate in the face, obviously harmful. Right. So that's the beginning of moral psychology. Let's say moral psychology 1.0, it's about harm. Okay. And then here comes 2.0, which is people like John Haidt, but really his advisor, Richard Schwader, goes to India, finds that Brahmin Indians condemn or moralize acts that don't seem obviously harmful, like an eldest son eating chicken after his father's funeral, right? They think that's wrong. And so Haidt and folks like Rick Schwader say, look, morality is not all just about emotional or physical harm, not obvious harm. Great. That's certainly true, right? So now we've expanded the moral sense beyond direct physical harm. But here's where Haidt, I think, makes this pivot to moral foundations theory, right? So he takes this kind of the understanding of the mind at the time, like divided into little boxes, and says, what are the little boxes that morality might be if it's beyond physical harm? Well, let's say these 5 foundations like fairness and loyalty and authority. We can talk about those. You know, they can go back to that episode. And so I think Haidt was absolutely right that there's a broader sense of morality beyond punching your classmate. But I think he was wrong in the sense that they're separate foundations, because there's really no good evidence that there are these separate boxes in the mind. It's not true. And a lot of neuroscience research recently has shown that the mind isn't segmented into these little modules or boxes. That's just not how the world or the mind works. I think what's also true, and this is what I've revealed in my research, is that all of these moral judgments about loyalty or authority, whether you're liberal or conservative, underneath these things, if you do the right studies, are driven by perceptions of harm. And so you condemn disloyal acts if you think they're harmful. You condemn people who are disrespectful to authorities if you think they're harmful. Right. And so if you go back to this example of the eldest son eating chicken after his father's funeral, which I talk about in the book, right, it seems kind of weird to Westerners. Like, how could it be that it's wrong to eat chicken after a funeral? I mean, I was at a funeral not too long ago and they had fried chicken. Well, it turns out that in this religion, the eldest son has to eat a vegetarian diet for about a month to process his father's death pollution. And if he eats chicken, he stops that processing and basically condemns his father to eternal suffering. So you think about it in those terms, right? It's clearly harmful, this act that seems not to be about direct physical harm. But in fact, if you take the perspective of this different culture, then it is about harm. So that's a roundabout way of saying that if you understand how people make sense of the world, all their moral judgments are ultimately still about harm. Harm is just a broader umbrella than it was understood maybe 40 years ago.
One other piece that I would love to hear you talk about that I thought was so interesting is this idea that harm is not necessarily something that we think through that's deliberate. And you talk about Kahneman and Tversky's work, right? And for those who are unfamiliar with it, it's this idea that we have maybe two styles of thinking. One is very automatic and rapid and almost reflexive, and the other is more deliberate. And so I wonder if you can talk more specifically about the system one versus system two idea about how we interpret harm, but also how does our life experience contribute to us landing in such different conclusions about what kinds of things are harmful, right? Because you do see differences between, for example, conservatives and liberals.
It's a great question. And I think that point, talking about system one and system two, greatly clarifies things, makes it a little more system one. Haidt's insight, I think the real insight he gave us was that morality is more about intuition. But he continued to think of harm as a matter of reasoning. I think my key claim is that harm is also a matter of intuition. And that when you see something happening that seems wrong, it seems wrong because it seems harmful in your gut. And the example that I like to use is being afraid of flying. Okay, so you can convince someone intellectually that flying is incredibly safe. In fact, it's safer than driving. But when someone's in the plane and they're sweating and they're, gripping the armrest and they're looking down out of the window, you say, "Why are you so afraid?" You're like, "Well, I'm afraid of flying. I'm afraid I'm going to die." And you say, "But that's impossible because rationally that it's safe to fly." But even though you know something rationally, doesn't mean you know it in your gut. And I think that happens with morality too. So you can learn that something might actually not be harmful, like, I don't know, let's say gay marriage, right? So gay marriage is a really big divide between liberals and conservatives, right? Secular folks and evangelicals. And so if you are a progressive, secular person, you're like, look, gay marriage is just a chance for people who love each other to showcase that love in public. On the other hand, if you are evangelical conservative, then you can see that act as something that's harmful. Now, that harm might not be the kind of like rational, right? It's hard to say, well, this causes harm in the following ways. But I think in their kind of like gut feeling, and I've done research on this, the harm that they see is maybe harm to a soul, maybe harm to America, weakening the bonds of marriage, making it harder to raise a family. Right? These harms are legitimately perceived by those who condemn it. And I think it's hard for people on one side to appreciate that those on the other legitimately and genuinely see these harms. But they do, and they're deep in their gut. And so appreciating that these harms are like deeply held, I think is really important.
You make this other point in your book that I loved, which is that it's often not the case that things are as simple as we make them out to be. And the case that I'm thinking about is like a couple who sees parenting in a different way, that one person sees it is harmful if you're harsh with the kids, if you say things that seem unloving, at a moment that they're acting out. Whereas the other parent thinks it's harmful if you don't discipline and sort of teach them how to behave appropriately in public and in the home. And that each person has a point, but taken to its extreme, probably either is not terribly healthy. But that if we can begin to see the nuance in harm and how we tend to get very like either or black and white in our interpretations of harm, that it can help us to appreciate where each side is coming from with a little bit more empathy.
Yeah, absolutely right. So it's certainly the case that some people are bad people, some people are evil, right? So we can all agree child abuse is wrong. But for the most part, when it comes to morality, most of us are well-meaning people. Most of us are well-meaning parents. And what we're disagreeing about is a relatively small area where there's clear trade-offs. So the parenting example is one I like a lot. Everyone's trying to protect their kids, and everyone feels so deeply that what they're doing is the right thing. And if you're a little more permissive and your partner is a little more boundary setting, right? Both of those ideals are about protecting your kid from harm. But I think when we're in these conflicts, again, I use the word flatten, which I really like, right? You see the other person as like intending harm, right? Whereas you're trying to protect them. But the other side is not intending harm. In the book, I talk about the destruction narrative as a story we frequently bring to moral conflicts, that one side's trying to kind of burn it all down, right? They're trying to destroy things. But that's not true at all. And most of these kind of conflicts with other parents, with spouses, they're not trying to destroy, they're trying to protect. And so I suggest that we should understand these conflicts with a protection narrative. Everyone's coming to the table trying to best protect the vulnerable, your kids, your relationship, but you just have different assumptions about the best way to enable that protection, right? And that's what causes conflict.
Absolutely. But then we get into like a little bit of a dicey territory of people feeling like it can be a betrayal to try to see things from the other side's point of view. And I experienced this in a couple different ways in the past year. One is on a professional level. So I wrote this piece in the Washington Post about this question of the utility of disclosing an affair. And the science on this is interesting. We can link to the article in our show notes, but it got such a backlash. And in fact, one blogger who blogs on behalf of victims of infidelity wrote about how I was a part of the therapy industrial complex and giving permission to people who are having affairs and condoning it and thinking that the person who was betrayed should ever try to see any humanity in somebody who had an affair. So that's like one example where trying to see the other side can really set you up to look like you're allying with somebody who has perpetrated atrocities. An even bigger example of that is after October 7th. So you can probably tell from my name that I have an Israeli heritage. And I write publicly, and I had a couple of people who wrote to me and asked, why don't you speak up? And it was so hard for me. But even saying that in this public forum, I think makes me vulnerable to attack. So I do think your book does a great job. And I wonder if you can say something about this idea of why understanding the other side can feel so much like betrayal to us.
Great question. And I love how you managed to bridge in this question from the very individual of being betrayed in a relationship to perhaps the longest standing conflict that the modern world has known. I mean, I think in the conflicts where we're most divided, there are legitimate cases to be made for a victim on either side. And that's what makes it so powerful. And that's what makes it so hard to come to a place where we can see eye to eye. So even with infidelity, right? Clearly the person who cheated is the person who is done the wrong, right? But in their mind, there's usually so many things leading up to that specific instance where they feel victimized, they feel aggrieved, and that this act is justified. And certainly with Israel-Palestine, and anything, right? The Troubles, all sorts of conflicts throughout time, every world war, right? There are cases on both sides where you can point to legitimate acts of suffering and victimization. And, we can disagree about which of those acts is bigger, which of those acts is worse. But in people's minds, they fixate on the one or most powerful instance that they suffered, and that drives their behavior. So I think the problem is it's true that people on each side have suffered and they anchor on that suffering. And that kind of feeling of victimization licenses people to act selfishly, to lash out, and really to fail to see the humanity or suffering of those on the other side.
That kind of gets us to this topic of what you call moral typecasting, which I think is a really interesting phenomenon that we sort of assign a victim and a villain character to each side of the equation. And that usually we see ourselves as the victim and the other side as the villain. So I wonder if you can maybe start us off with just defining like what is moral typecasting? Why do we do it? And then what are the costs?
Sure. So typecasting is something that anyone who's watched a movie understands. Daniel Radcliffe, it's hard for us to think of him as anyone other than Harry Potter, right? Which, sad for him, which is why he's done all these weird roles. But you see him down the street and still your first thought is Harry Potter. And so with morality, it's the same way. Except in terms of, instead of wizards, we see someone as either just a villain or just a victim. And this works with Hollywood too. So I think of like Alan Rickman, speaking of Harry Potter, he's Snape, he's Hans Gruber, uber villain there too. It's hard to think of him as like a victim. And same with orphans, right? When you think of orphans in movies or in real life, it's hard for you to think of them as being villains. So we cast others as either villains or victims. And what that means is if you're a villain, then you're not a victim, which means we never think of the pain or suffering of a villain. And if you're a victim, you're not a villain, which means we never think of you being blamed. And so this kind of tension shifts people from the kind of like murky moral actors that we all are, some combination of blame and pain, to seeing others as only evil or as only victims. And as you say, we only typically see ourselves as victims if we've suffered, right? So if someone says something terrible to us, if someone cheats us, we're so focused on how we've been aggrieved that we never think, did I do something to cause this? Am I somewhat to blame for this? And so this tension happens in court cases, for instance, right? This is why when people come to court, they're defendants, they try to look like the victim to escape blame. And it's also why we never think of the inner pain of villains, because we just think of them, you're as a villain, right? You can't suffer. You're a bad person. And so this 0 to 100 kind of suffering or blame really inhibits our ability to see across divides in our everyday lives. If I can't acknowledge that I'm at least 1% blameworthy for something, it's hard to have a conversation about it.
Totally. And that is the genius of Harry Potter, right? Because even if we can't see Alan Rickman as anything but evil, through the narrative of the book, of the series, you really start to see a lot of complexity in the character of Severus Snape. And that to me is so beautiful, because the narrative of the book does this play on our inclination to just see somebody in this very all or nothing way. Like, there's an innocent person and then there's the person who is the harmer. And it's almost always so much more complicated than that if you really get into the nitty gritty. I mean, one thing that I think your book does that's really interesting is you try to bring the reader in to see, even Hitler, this very extreme version, this person who perpetrated all sorts of awful, awful things, had some difficulty in his early life. And we don't need to forgive his acts, but can we try to see his suffering too? Is that possible? And it's like an interesting exercise.
Right. The chapter on typecasting starts out with, no one thinks about Hitler's inner pain. And of course, fair enough. Like, I'm not an apologist for any villain, and he's 99.999999, maybe repeating almost is evil, but he did suffer abuse as a kid, right? And so just appreciating this fact seems evil in itself to many people, right? The fact that like there's this pure villain, we can all understand that he's a pure villain, but there's maybe this like tiny, tiny seed of victimhood there. And then the other example I use in the book is this young man who was brutally abused by his stepmom and his father and his stepsister from a very young age. I mean, just so unfortunate. Like reading about this kid every time, I just feel so sad, right? So sad about his experiences. But then when he's 13, he shoots his stepmother and his father and his stepsister, and it's like triple murder. And eventually he only gets a few years in prison. And my feeling towards him is again one of sympathy, but there's still this like seed in there. Like, did he really have to shoot his stepsister? Maybe his stepsister was also a victim as part of this. It's complicated. So all I'm trying to do is to encourage readers just to entertain a little bit of shades of gray. Primo Levi, this writer who survived the Holocaust, I end the chapter with his thoughts about this kind of gray zone, right? He really encouraged readers to think about the gray zone as he beheld kind of Jewish folks in the camps, maybe sometimes collaborating with Nazis as a way to survive and make sense of the terrible conditions in which they lived, right? So he was thinking, don't think about anyone as a 0% or 100%, although he was obviously 100% against the Nazis. But other people in the camps, he was trying to make sense of the kind of like gray shades of their moral existence.
Yeah. And to me, I think this has so much power. Like it feels so scary. And maybe I'm going to try to frame this as a question, but like, what is the power of trying to see somebody who is, say, 99% pretty evil? What's the utility of trying to see their humanity, of trying to see their suffering?
Well, I think even accepting that some people are truly incredibly evil, if we just shift just a little bit off 100% absolutely evil, then it allows us, when we go along the continuum and encounter kind of more everyday people who maybe voted differently. So I think I like to distinguish, to anchor it more in kind of politics today, from kind of your opinion of people who are politicians or elites in the media, right? Who you may very much dislike. And that's okay to very much dislike people who you think are very evil, right? Elites, leaders. But if you can think about everyday people, the half the country that voted differently from you, kind of shifting off this 100% and 0% to 99% and 1% gives you some grace when you interact or have conversations with everyday people, I think is really powerful, because it means that the person on the subway or the person at the PTA meeting or the person sitting across from you in the couples therapy session, right, is not 100% evil, right? They're just like trying to figure out their world as best they can. And it doesn't mean that you have to give up your moral convictions. And it doesn't mean you have to give up thinking that maybe they're more to blame than you are. But more to blame than you is very different than all to blame and you're none to blame.
Yeah, I think that is so powerful. It reminds me of this framework from a book called Difficult Conversations called the Joint Contributory System. So if we begin to think about like the ways that we all play into these systems, and particularly these systems that can become really divisive, then we can at least keep our corner a little bit cleaner, make our contributions a little bit more positive and productive, as opposed to contributing in a negative way, which is, I think, what the reflex is when our moral outrage button gets pressed, is to sort of double down. Like, well, if you're going to harm me, I'm not only going to self-protect, but I'm going to continue to weigh in a way that you might then perceive as harmful. I'm only doing it because I'm protecting myself. So we self-justify. And then we find ourselves acting in ways that are increasingly problematic. And maybe you can even share some of the research on this. I think it's really interesting. Like when we see the other side, for example, as being anti-democratic, what does your work and work from your colleagues suggest that we do in response?
Yeah, I mean, happy to talk about the research. I love the point, and almost just want to take a little step back to think about something that, many of us are familiar about. And when we have a conflict, whether that's at work or with a spouse, or I always see it with my kids, right? They always escalate and they always kind of build off each other, right? So my 5-year-old will poke at my 8-year-old and she'll say something back. And so you can point the blame at the other side. And it's true in a sense, because the 5-year-old's bugging the 8-year-old and the 8-year-old is maybe the one who throws the first punch. But ultimately, right, whether or not you can say that each side's to blame, each side has a causal role in what's occurring. And so I think that's really important, right? Like what's causing it? And almost always there's something that you did that's involved. Maybe we need to take a step back here and think about who's causally responsible. And I think when you scale up to kind of politics, the research you talked about is like, not only does each side have a kind of contribution to worsening discourse or to anti-democratic things, but in our minds, we think the other side is much worse than they actually are. So if you voted blue, then you think folks who voted red, like they're committed to getting elected no matter what, right? They're trying to destroy democracy. But if you ask folks who voted red, they think the same thing about you. And if they're against democracy, the only reason they are is because they think that you are. And it's a kind of race to the bottom, right? Like if they're subverting democracy, well, then I better hurry up and do it too. And so it's just like this pluralistic ignorance. We all think the other side is against democratic norms. And so I guess I should subvert them too. But at the end of the day, right, we're all trying to protect democracy, and we're all trying to not punch our sister as best we can, in a sense, right? But we're just like perceiving the actions on the other side as being bad, as being wrong, and we're trying to preemptively get the jump on them. But obviously this is wrong.
I loved one set of your studies too that I'll just bring up because I think it's so interesting is that we all make mistakes about our opposition. Your work suggests that we tend to, and this is a quote from your book, that we tend to think of our political opponents as stupid, but there is no consistent evidence of an association between political ideology and cognitive ability. And in fact, what the research shows is that we all get dumber when we think about politics. So can you talk a little bit about that finding?
Yeah, I love the finding. And the idea is just motivated reasoning, right? So if you're familiar with kind of how our minds work, you're familiar with the idea that we're all really focused on thinking critically until it comes to supporting our own worldviews. And then we all fudge the facts a little bit. We all share that post on social media that we're not totally sure if it's true, but it's probably true and it supports where we're coming from. And so this happens when it comes to evaluating stats too, right? We just have like a looser criteria for what's true. And so studies show that we're less skeptical of things we already agree with. And if we disagree with it, well, then we get really skeptical. When we disagree with something is when we really get into the math and we're really good at it. But when we already agree, we're like, yeah, that sounds about right.
That is so interesting. And you could just think about this in your own life. Like when things go well, you're like, of course. And when they go bad, you're like, why would that ever happen? What did I do to deserve this? But we never ask, what did I do to deserve this when really great things happen? We just think, oh, I deserve this.
Exactly.
That motivated reasoning is so much a part of the fabric of our minds. And it so often comes up in interpersonal relationships. And so we are really critical thinkers when it comes to other people who are saying things we don't agree with, and far less so when people agree with us. All right. I wanted to also pivot and talk to you about your story of marital outrage. And one of the things that I hope people take from this conversation and from your book is just how normal and natural and reflexive moral outrage is, right? It's not something that we're ever going to overcome, but by becoming more aware of it and gaining some tools to manage it, we become a lot more adept at managing those moral impulses in ways that are productive for our relationships and productive for our society as opposed to destructive. So you shared a story in your book, and I wonder if you can share it here.
Sure, happy to do it. So it's a funny story. My kids were younger. We just put them down. Everything was dark. Everything was quiet. I was creeping around in the bedroom trying to get something so I could go downstairs. Turns out my wife also creeping around in the bedroom. I didn't realize it. We bump into each other in the dark, scare the hell out of each other. And our first thoughts were like, what were you doing? Why were you being so evil, in a sense, sneaking around this bedroom trying to scare me? And so, of course, neither of us were actively trying to scare the other person, right? But we were just so overwhelmed with fear because we were attacked in the dark, so to speak, that we were outraged at each other. And so we said some unkind things to each other and then eventually laughed about it half an hour later. But you could just imagine that inciting incident could have led us to say more unkind things. And then, well, what about this time we went on vacation? You did this terrible, right? We could have blown up our entire marriage from this thing. And it obviously didn't happen, but it's so easy to feel outraged, such a randomly small event.
Yeah. One of my kids will step on the other's toe and like they're all of a sudden in this intense fight. And it's like, whoa, calm down. But it's just so instinctive. Like when we feel pain, when we feel harmed in some way, our instinct is to point a finger and really vilify the other person and really identify with the victim role. And so you offer throughout your book some tips on how to manage that instinctual response, how to bridge the divide when we disagree with other people. So I wonder if you can share some thoughts on what can we do when we are trying to make sense of people with whom we disagree? What kinds of questions might we ask ourselves?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the point you made earlier about how this moral conflict tends to flatten people into either victims or villains, right? So if I feel like the victim because someone stepped on my toe or made me feel upset because I said something unkind, then the reason I fail to see you as a human being, as a potential victim yourself, is because it's just hard for me to disengage from my own feelings of victimization to understand how you might suffer. And so the way past that kind of flattening is by telling stories about your own feelings, your own vulnerabilities, your own suffering. And so, right, it could be as simple as, look, the reason that I acted this way is because I felt the following, right? I felt like I was treated unkindly and, I statements, right? I was sad and I was upset. I should say, you don't want to have these conversations when people are actively pissed off. Like if your kid gets their foot stepped on and then immediately you're like, use I statements and tell stories, right? Sometimes you just need to calm down. You need to take a time out. So this only works when you're calm, right? But you want to tell stories. So with politics, if you're trying to say why you are pro-gun rights, let's say, we have a study that shows that if you're saying, I'm pro-gun rights because one day my mom used a gun to defend herself from a home intruder, well, that goes a lot further than saying I'm pro-gun rights because here's a statistic about how many times people use guns to defend themselves in America. An impartial statistic doesn't resonate because it doesn't help people see you as someone vulnerable and concerned about suffering. But a personal story of vulnerability does, right? We want to make it clear that we are a person who can suffer, not someone who's callous and unkind.
I love that advice to kind of show your own humanity and your own sort of capacity for suffering, and also to really be deliberate about looking for other people who you may not intrinsically see as capable of suffering, to actively look for their humanity, to almost recognize that you're going to instinctively not want to, but to deliberately pursue it. Because I think that is the way that we can help ourselves to see the depth in other people, especially when we disagree with them, when we think on the face of it that their beliefs are immoral or behaviors that they've done are unconscionable or something.
Absolutely. One of the best tips I've heard about for having better conversations come from the work of Nick Epley, who suggests that we should ask more questions and ask deeper questions. And it's so weird for people to think that we should do this. It's especially weird for people to think we should do this in conversations where we're worried that there might be conflict. But if you approach a political opponent or a spouse you're having a tough time with and you say, well, what are your hopes for the future? What are you most worried about? What are you afraid about? These are deep questions that reveals people's humanity and their vulnerability. And those are the kind of questions that, when asked, help to bridge these divides that are growing in society today.
And Adam Grant just recently had your book in his list of top 10 picks for the coming year. And his book, Think Again, is another book that really advocates for people really pursuing the information that may be counterintuitive, that may not sort of align with what you already think. So there's a lot of research suggesting this is not innate, it's not instinctual, but that if we pursue information about people that we don't automatically see, that we can really get to know them, that we can make connections, that we can see their humanity, that we can better cooperate and collaborate on the things that we all find really important. So let me just finish with a quote from your book, which is that the goal of this book is to, quote, help us see morality as more of a gradient than a clever line, and to recognize the complexity and trade-offs surrounding moral issues. Holding this complexity within our minds will hopefully provide us with a more accurate and nuanced picture of our fellow human beings. So thank you, Kurt, for sharing your wisdom here with us. I hope people grab a copy of your incredible book, Outraged. And where else can people go to find out more about you and your work?
I've got a website, kurtjgray.com, and I have a Substack, Moral Understanding Substack. And so we talk about the book there, but also all sorts of posts on making sense of our complicated moral world today.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.